My name is Christina Davis. I am the director of the program on U.S.-Japan relations. And I am delighted to welcome you all here today for a very interesting event to discuss an important political moment in Japan, which is the transition from long-serving Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to the entry of a new Prime Minister Suga. And at moments of change, it is great to come together as a larger community to reflect on what has the administration of Prime Minister Abe meant for Japanese politics, US-Japan relations. And we're very fortunate to have a large audience here today. So thank you very much. We have, I think, almost 100 people will be joining us. And we're very fortunate to have leading experts to guide us through the conversation. And so let me introduce Mr. Tobias Harris, who is the Senior Vice President of Teneo Company. And as Senior Vice President of Teneo, he has become one of the leading analysts of Japanese politics, economy, strategy, to help those of us in the Western world to understand what we need to know about what is happening in Japan. Now, Teneo is a very interesting company that he works with. It is a consulting firm focused on communication, advising. There's actually a New York Times article that referred to it as a constellation of influencers. That is the chief executive's best friend. And so I can only imagine that in the role working for this company, and especially as the lead consultant for thinking about Japan, that Tobias has had a range of issues on which he advises. And we're all very fortunate that he shares these in his widely read blog, Observing Japan. And he has also written a new book, The Iconoclast, Shinzo Abe and the New Japan, just recently released with perfect timing as it comes right at the end of the Abe administration. We're also very fortunate to have joining us Mr. Koji Sonoda, who is a former associate with the program on US-Japan relations in the year 2015 to 16. And Mr. Sonoda is a leading correspondent for the Asahi Shimbun, which is, of course, as we know, is one of the leading newspapers in Japan. He was the Washington Bureau correspondent in 2018 to the present, and has himself written a book on Shinzo Abe, the man who shakes up the country, written in Japanese, of course. And he is going to help lead off our discussion of Mr. Harris's presentation. He will be joined by another associate with the US-Japan program from the Asahi Shimbun. We will have our associate, Mr. Kotaro Ono, ask a leading question. So I am very happy now to introduce our speakers, and also first to give a little highlight about who is going to speak next week. Next week, we'll be hosting Amy Katalinik on how pork barrel politics holds Japan's governing coalition together. And I would also like to remind you of Zoom etiquette, to keep your microphone muted and be sure to raise your hand in the participants if you would like to ask a question. We've asked Tobias to keep his remarks to 20-30 minutes so that we will have a short Q&A at the end of the session after our discussant comments from Mr. Shinoda and the question from Ono-san. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Davis, for really that tremendously kind introduction. It really, I remember as a graduate student sitting at sessions like this, and so it's always such a nice sort of a virtual homecoming. I wish events had made a physical homecoming possible, but I'll take what I can get. And of course, it is so nice to see so many friends and familiar names and hopefully faces over the course of the conversation here. Thank you, Shin, of course, for really reaching out and making this possible. Dr. Farr, the entire US-Japan program, really tremendously grateful for the opportunity. I am going to keep my remarks on the shorter side because given the people we have in attendance, I would love to get to questions sooner. I mean, I found in these talks I've done, there's almost a limitless amount of subjects people want to talk about when it comes to Abe, and that should tell you something. And maybe that's a good way to kick things off. That when we think about what Abe's legacy is going to be and how he's going to be remembered, I mean really that his nearly 8 years in office were just a tremendously um, busy period for Japanese politics and Japan's government in a way that really we hadn't seen, if ever, in a long time, if not ever. I mean, really, where there was activity on all fronts, and Abe was traveling the world and was announcing new initiatives and was at least the appearance of activity constantly, and that really gives us a lot to digest. I mean, really, it's in some ways one of the major reasons for writing this book, that there's just so much that was done over the course of these years, and trying to look through it and figure out what really is going to last, what really is going to stick, and what looks more ephemeral and less durable when we think about Abe's legacy. I mean, I think the main thing, and we're really learning the extent to which this is part of his legacy, and to which it really enabled him to last as long as it did. And that starts with political stability, and I think the discussion really has to start there, because the fact that Japan did have a continuous government for the better part of a decade, when you saw a tremendous amount of political instability in other countries, and when you had recent memories of very short-lived governments in Japan. I mean, the significance of that kind of change, the potential that opened for Japan really cannot be understated, that it really enabled activist government to an extent that hadn't quite been possible, certainly in the years between Koizumi and Abe's second government. What we're seeing, I think, in the transition to Suga is that it's quite possible that the factors that enabled Abe to last could continue. And I think that tells you the extent to which Abe was the beneficiary maybe of conditions outside of his control, rather than the architect of his political stability. And what I mean by that is what we saw. I mean, I think we have to take into account the fact that Suga went from polling around 3% when people were asked who they wanted as the next prime minister in July, to becoming, depending on which measure you look at, the third most popular new prime minister Japan has had. And that is a meaningful number. And that tells you that, even as Abe's approval ratings fell over the course of this year, and a lot of that had to do with the pandemic, the public still wants stability. They still want a government that is capable of acting, that, that can rely on the public behind it, and really can act as if it has something. We can debate what a mandate is, but something resembling a mandate. And they want a leader who's going to stay. They didn't want Suga to be a caretaker. They're willing to, I think, forgive a lot. And that, to some extent, is the lesson of Abe's last several years in office, when, from 2017 onwards, was facing scandal after scandal. And his approval ratings really did not fall far below 50% until this year. And that really tells you the public, it would really take something very significant, like a pandemic, for the public really to abandon a leader to the extent that we saw this year. And that means I think Suga really has a chance to last, that if he can avoid missteps, if he can avoid shocks, external shocks, that he really, the public, I think, would prefer him to stay. They're not looking for change. There's really an appetite for stability to continue into the future. And that again will open up possibilities for policy. Looking at sort of Abe's policy legacy and what political stability enabled him to do, one of the things that we really, I think we can measure the success or look at the durability of Abe's legacy by the extent to which not only Suga, but really in some ways, when you looked at the race to succeed him, you looked at what Ishiba was offering or Kishida was offering, there really actually wasn't that much difference. I mean, Suga, of course, was running explicitly as the continuity candidate. He had been Abe's chief cabinet secretary. He was positioning himself to carry on the work that Abe was doing. But it is very unlikely that had somehow Kishida won or Ishiba won, that you would have gotten major departures. And that really goes to show the extent to which Abe's choices have essentially tied the hands of his successors. You look at economic policy. On monetary policy, the Bank of Japan is pretty much locked in on its unconventional monetary policy program. There's not much room to do much new, but there's also not much room to retreat from that. On fiscal policy, the kind of mix you've seen where there's an emphasis on growth in the near term, but over the longer term, there's going to be some attempts to stabilize Japan's fiscal situation, which includes the possibility of future consumption tax hikes, that kind of policy mix, there's not really much room to consider something else. There's not really, anyone saying, okay, we have to do much, austerity now, that it's so urgent to get the fiscal situation under control. But also there's not really much consideration of more radical, unconventional fiscal policy. There are people who are calling for something like modern monetary theory and that Japan can run whatever deficits it wants. That's not really in the mainstream. No one was calling for that. Suga certainly isn't calling for that. And so that sort of policy mix on the macroeconomic side is likely to continue almost indefinitely. There's not really any kind of appetite for shifting in either direction. And Abe really, his choices repeatedly over the course of his 8 years foreclosed a lot of options for his successors. You can see the same thing at work really on the foreign policy side too. And in this way, there's a lot more success to build on. And we've seen in the early weeks, Suga's already picked up on really, I think, what was Abe's main achievement, which were really strengthening relationships between Japan and India, Australia, and the countries of Southeast Asia, and recognizing that to the extent that there is competition with China, that the competition is over ensuring the political independence and the economic independence of the countries of Southeast Asia, more than it is about how do we change the Chinese regime. And that really, the focus on, Abe's focus really from January 2013, his first foreign trip, also to Southeast Asia, where he goes to Indonesia and lays out this vision in a speech in Jakarta. It really was this idea of, Japan is going to do what it can to help the countries of Southeast Asia, especially, resist China in their maritime conflict in the South China Sea, but also that Japan was going to be a source of aid, a source of infrastructure investment. Really, that Japan was going to deepen its integration, its economic integration with Southeast Asia. And that was really a consistent theme, really from the beginning right up until the end. And it was really, arguably, really Abe's area of greatest success. As part of that, I think you saw deepening the links within the Quad. So not only strengthening alliance ties with the United States, but then also bilateral, trilateral ties with Australia. The bilateral relationship with India is certainly stronger. There's been a lot of talk over the years about the promise of Japan's bilateral relationship with India. That has now been actualized in ways that really had never been done before. Economically, you have a Japanese business presence in India in a way that you hadn't had before. Politically, militarily, Japan and India, that relationship now might be one of the single most important bilateral relationships, certainly in the region, if not globally. And that relationship, I think, is in all likelihood going to continue. The investment is there. The all government approach to that is likely to continue. And Suga has already picked up on that. And there's no reason to think that there's going to be any real deviation from that. And you're already finding new initiatives to add to that approach. At the start of September, you saw, as Abe transitioned to Suga, the launch of a new supply chain resilience initiative with Australia, India, and Japan. So that is going to remain a central pillar of Japan's foreign policy, its regional policy. The other, I think, continuity that you're going to see, and really the limitations and finding a new direction for Abe's successors, is sort of the model that he developed as far as China is concerned. That post 2017, you did see an approach that stressed, China is our neighbor. We are economically integrated. Decoupling is not going to be an option. The Japanese business community doesn't want it. Japan's growth really depends on finding ways to benefit from Asia's growing middle classes, no more so than China. So that means Chinese tourism. That means Chinese workers, Chinese students. It means opening Japan to the region and to the world really does depend on economic integration with China. And so a commitment to that and safeguarding that. And at the same time, a kind of compartmentalization, sort of finding a way to balance between real, genuine security concerns, both maritime concerns and concerns about China's growing military power, and then also issues about espionage, economic security issues, of course, and cybersecurity, and finding a way to balance those concerns, but not ever really going so far that it really causes an enduring rift with China. And in some ways taking advantage of China's interest in safeguarding a relationship with Japan. And I think really the best example of this is that you had these talks within the framework of economic cooperation that focused on Japan's participation in the Belt and Road Initiative, which ended up not really becoming formal participation, and in some ways it's Japan's insistence that they would cooperate on quality infrastructure, which had been the Abe government's approach all along, ended up being embraced by China, at least rhetorically. I mean, at the Second Belt and Road Forum, Xi Jinping comes out and he's talking about how China is going to stress quality infrastructure, which was such a funny thing to hear after all these years of Japan talking about it, to hear the Chinese president break out the same terminology. And so, trying to find a way to walk that tightrope, to subtly influence China's behavior, not transform China, but to nudge China in the direction that favors Japan's principles and Japan's vision for the region, is something that I think is going to continue. Kind of touched on in all of this, and certainly something that I think Suga is going to pick up on, in part because he was really the main, one of the main instigators within the Abe government, is the idea of Japan as a regional and global economic rule setter. And it was really one of Abe's 2 or 3 major foreign policy achievements, something that really, it's really remarkable. He moved back in 2013, and he's elected on this majority where many of his own backbenchers ran as anti-TPP candidates, and overcoming that resistance first to bring Japan into the talks, and then navigating their resistance to get a deal done, and then making Japan the leader of a post-U.S. withdrawal Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2017. I mean, that transformation, and now we're at the point where Japan has sealed a bilateral FTA with the EU, has a new agreement with the UK. I mean, these trade agreements, when you compare it to the amount of controversy that greeted Japan's entree into TPP, I mean, it is remarkable, the transformation. And some of that was Abe's reform of the agricultural cooperative system. I mean, there is now an openness to Japan playing a role in economic rule setting that just was not there before, and really is, I think, going to go forward, in part because Suga was such an instrumental player within government deliberations on Japan playing that role, both on the trade side, and also I think an issue that he took a leadership role on was Japan opening to international migration in ways that it hadn't been before. I mean, not to the extent maybe seen in its other peer democracies, but more than ever before. You certainly have more foreign residents of Japan than ever before. And Suga really was a major driver behind that. I mean, Abe really entrusted Suga with getting a major revision to the worker visa system in 2018 past the finish line. And so that's going to continue under Suga. I think they're really eager to reopen Japan to international travel once the pandemic's over. And that's something that's going to continue under his watch. Maybe in the questions, we'll talk a little bit about some of the areas where Abe's foreign policy legacy is less successful. I mean, I think on Russia, he invested a lot of time and got very little to show for it. I think maybe that's a place where we're going to see a course correction and a place where there's maybe some room for Suga to change directions. And of course, maybe the biggest question in Japan's neighborhood is South Korea, and whether we're going to see a departure from Suga is, I mean, he might be a little too constrained. And also, again, like in other areas, by the choices that Abe made, and the fact that I think the Japanese government now finds itself in a position where it has to retaliate if, for example, the South Korean courts liquidate assets that were seized from Nippon Steel. But the overall pattern is that Abe did make choices in all of these areas where there is just not a lot of room for great departures. I think there's room for building upon what Abe did. I think maybe some shift in emphasis. Like, for example, I think we're seeing Suga emphasize digitalization. I think there was a lot maybe of lip service to digitalization during the Abe years, but it didn't end up really being the kind of priority that it needed to be. And Suga is, of course, investing a lot of energy in making that priority and a major achievement for his government in its first year. That is a difference, but I don't know if it really counts as a departure. I mean, it certainly fits with the overall approach where you'd have the Abe government kind of set a direction, use a variety of tools, whether that's sort of state-led efforts, which we're going to see once we get a digital agency stood up next year, or whether that's the use of subsidies or the use of regulatory experimentation. I mean, it's the same overall pattern, kind of a state-led efforts to ensure that Japan remains competitive in the 21st century. And that was really the hallmark of what was called the third era of Abenomics. we're not going to really see, I think, a major change. There's some talk that we might go back toward a more Koizumi Takenaka style neoliberalism. I don't think there's enough yet to suggest that there's going to really be a break in that direction from the Suga government. And maybe that really brings me to the final point, and that is, in some ways, what we get with Suga is a distillation of Abeism to its essence, which really is that Japan faces severe and significant ongoing challenges, both domestically and internationally, in the 21st century, and that Japan needs a strong state that is able to navigate those challenges. And that was, I think, the main thrust of Abe's approach, but you did have some of the symbolic culture war politics attached to that. It is very unlikely that we're going to get a lot of that from Suga. It is not something that he's really ever talked about a lot in the past, but he is, I think, as much of a statist as Abe. I think he is very much someone who wants to use the power of the Japanese state and make the Japanese state stronger to solve these problems, to manage these problems, and to ensure that Japan remains relevant internationally in the decades ahead. And that really seems to be the main thrust that we're hearing from Suga. He is sort of a national politician. He wants to rise above factional politics. He's not part of a faction. I know Amy's out there, and she's going to maybe have a question about his dependence on factions to be elected, and that's something maybe to talk about in the Q&A. But he does, he's not dependent on a single faction per se. He talks always about wanting to overcome bureaucratic stovepiping and really have a national approach to government. This is someone who knows how sort of the top-led system of policymaking that was refined during the Abe years worked. I mean, he really made it work, and we're already seeing ways in which he's putting that to use and really relying on what have been called kante kanryo, the bureaucrats who are centered in the prime minister's office. And so that style of policymaking that we saw during the Abe years, if anything, might be brought to new heights under Suga, because he's someone who was so critical to making that happen. And is free maybe of some of the constraints that Abe still faced, even as he wanted to realize this vision. So this is, I think that's what really we're going to expect from Suga going forward. Certainly what I think he wants to achieve as prime minister. There are a lot of perils and pitfalls out there that could complicate his efforts to stay in power. And, so we'll see what the year brings, but we're really going to see a pursuance, a realization in many ways of what Abe politics was about. And that really tells you the extent to which Abe has left a pretty sticky legacy going forward. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to both Sonoda-san's remarks and remarks from the audience.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, comprehensive overview. And now we have a few questions from Mr. Sonoda-san.
Mr. Hollis, thank you very much for your great discussion, and also congratulations for your new fantastic book, The Iconoclast. And as I am introduced, I have covered the Abe administration since 2007, and from my view, your great book gives us deep insights on how Abe committed himself to his political slogan, breaking away from the post-war regime, and also deepens our understanding of what he achieved and what he failed during his administration. So let me ask three questions to you. So firstly, as you mentioned, Abe's falling legacy. And with regard to Japan's long-term administrations, Prime Minister Yoshida achieved Japan's independence by San Francisco Peace Treaty and post-war reconstruction. And Prime Minister Sato achieved Okinawa's reversion. But although Abe worked on reversion of the northern territories with Russia, North Korea's abduction issue, and China policy, well, it seems that he did not get any outstanding achievement on these issues. And of course, he surely has strengthened the US-Japan alliance and enhanced the free and open Indo-Pacific vision. But at the same time, the relations between Japan and South Korea have deteriorated more than ever before. So Professor Takashi Mikuriya said, quote, Prime Minister Abe is good at politically performing what he is doing something now, in Japanese, yatterukan, as he starts new policies one after another, unquote. And also said that his biggest legacy was that he ran the longest term stable administration for the international community. You pointed out on this issue in your book, quote, while Abe's Japan became less hesitant about pursuing a global leadership role, his legacy as a global statesman would be surprisingly tenuous, unquote. So my question is, why do you think he did not achieve an outstanding foreign policy like Yoshida and Sato, except long-term political stability? And secondly, my question is on revising the Constitution. In your book, you described in details on how Prime Minister Abe succeeded Kishi's ambition to accomplish true independence by revising the Article 9. And you said, quote, despite being the longest serving and the most powerful prime minister of the post-war era, he will leave his office having failed to achieve the one change he sought above all others, and ambition that he had absorbed from the time he was dandled on his grandfather's knee, unquote. After all, but at the same time, you mentioned on Abe's constitutional reinterpretation of Article 9, and quote, after all, he delivered significant constitutional reform when he reinterpreted the Constitution and implemented change to Japan's national security laws, unquote. I was covering Abe's constitutional reinterpretation in 2015, and I really felt that Abe had a very firm resolve and obsession with this issue. However, he has done constitutional reinterpretation. I did not feel that he had a very strong motivation to revise the Constitution as he did for his reinterpretation. So I thought at the time that the fact was that he has not stuck to revise the Constitution anymore by finishing reinterpretation. And the reason why he showed his motivation to revise the Constitution to the public was some of his political maneuver to get support from Nippon Kaigi and other conservative hardliners in order to achieve his new goal, the longest term of administration in the history. So my question is, do you think that Prime Minister Abe seriously tried to revise the Article 9 after his success of reinterpretation of Article 9? And also, what is your view on why Abe did not achieve constitutional revision, which is perceived as his biggest political goal? And thirdly, my question is on political ethics and morals during the Abe administration. You mentioned in your book on Moritomo and Kake, two major political scandals. I think these scandals came from three reasons. Firstly, Kante has increasingly tightened its grip on bureaucrats. And also, and it's also, as you mentioned, the word of sontaku as Japan's political vernacular. And also, secondly, checks and balances at the Diet does not work anymore because of the weak opposition parties, which came from the collapse of two-party system. Thirdly, checks and balances at the ruling Liberal Democrat Party also does not work because of the weak factions which came from single-seat electoral district system. Particularly on Moritomo scandal, no politician took their responsibility, even though kinky local finance bureau staff killed himself on this issue. It seems that Kante increasingly tend not to hold their accountability for what they did due to lack of checks and balances since the administration, such as Science Council issue recently. So my question is, what is your take on the influences of Abe's long-term administration on Japan's political ethics and morals? So these are my questions. Abe's legacy and the revised constitution and political ethics and morals. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sonoda-san, because you really, I love these questions because each one enables me to I think, draw out a major, I think, important running theme of the book. Each one, as I listened, I mean, it really, you set me up perfectly. So thank you. We couldn't have planned it any better. So to the first question about, having some sort of durable achievement that you'll be able to say in 30 years, this was the thing that Abe did. I think there's a lesson from that. And, there was this dream, in the early 90s as sort of the great Heisei period of reform began, and everyone wanted top-down leadership, and you would change the system, and you'd have strong leaders and two parties competing on policy differences. And in some ways, Abe was the realization of that dream, right? You've got a strong prime minister at the top of the system who, was elected on a policy platform and had really had to kind of sharpen his policy beliefs while he was making his way, in the wilderness, and he came back and led the LDP back in with a new program. I think the reality and really maybe the enduring lesson of the Abe years is that even with a strong leader, a leader who doesn't really face much opposition within his party or from the opposition, Japan is still a mature democracy. Change is still hard going. It is something that you're never going to be able to sweep away the problems. That Abe was never going to be able to just come up with sort of a perfect plan and the demographic challenges are going to go away. You're never going to once and for all solve the challenges posed by China. This is a long-term challenge that is going to be constant. It's going to require just sort of constant vigilance and adjustments as the region changes. And that in some ways is what his record was. It was sort of this kind of constant shuffling and moving and reacting, and with creativity though. And that's the thing that, so maybe, changing relations with India, for example, is not something that ever going to say, okay, it's accomplished once and for all. I mean, we don't have to think about it, but setting the pattern of kind of creative, dynamic leadership was something new, and showing that what you're going to get from a stronger leader is not going to be, breaking through crises once and for all. It really is going to be managing them and ensuring that, that Japan isn't essentially overwhelmed by its constraints, that it still has ways of living with them and still being heard. That decline does not mean that Japan is going to disappear or that Japan's voice, is going to be silenced internationally. And that is a legacy in its way. I mean, it is not something as tangible as Okinawa reversion. It is not as tangible as the end of the occupation, but it's probably, in retrospect, really a more realistic sense of what even a strong prime minister is going to be able to achieve going forward. That some of these problems are so baked in and are just now going to be part of the landscape that this is what a prime minister in power is going to have to do and going to have to live with. And I think your point about Abe sort of proposing things and not always following through. I mean, I think certainly in economic policy that was often a challenge. That there was on the plus side, there was a lot of experimentation and a lot of willingness to kind of put ideas out there. But it did mean there wasn't often as much focus on following through. And I think something that we might see that's different from Suga is, I think, because he's so detail oriented, that there might actually be more follow through. That he is, for example, stressed digitalization. He is certainly, I think, for a long time has made clear that that's a priority. I think it is likely that you're going to see more follow through on some of these ideas, that it's not going to be as scattershot. So that might actually be an improvement in some ways from what you saw during the Abe years. but I think the style of leadership is going to be something that it's really in some ways the only way that Japan is going to manage with its constraints, and so that I think explains it. I mean, we also have to be realistic as to what he could achieve. I mean, the idea that it was never very likely that Vladimir Putin was going to return an inch of Russian soil, and really, I mean, I think his it's not like Putin doesn't have any domestic constraints and that he could just offer even 2 islands to Japan without there being some sort of domestic consequences for him. And so I think it was always, the amount of effort that Abe put into it, certainly in his last several years, versus what the likelihood of success was always probably a bit unrealistic. North Korea, the same thing. I mean, the ball has been in North Korea's court for several years, and I think North Korea has made clear that it doesn't, that it has other options when it comes to getting international assistance and international recognition, and that Japan was a low priority, certainly as long as you had a U.S. administration that was receptive. I mean, maybe that will change, if you have a change of U.S. administration, that suddenly working with Japan will look more inviting. But that's a circumstance that was out of Abe's control, and you can only, I mean, is it fair to criticize him? I mean, I think he deserves more criticism for making relations with South Korea worse and not being as flexible and creative as he was in some other policy areas, and almost willingly wanting to make relations with South Korea worse. And again, there's blame to go around. It is not solely Abe's fault that relations with South Korea have worsened, but one confronted with a change of administration in South Korea, I mean, I think instead of saying, okay, how can we find a way to work with a country that's a rich democracy in our neighborhood that's also a U.S. ally, I think there was a determination to almost force the Moon administration to submit unconditionally to Japan's demands, and I think that was never going to work. That was never going to be palatable domestically in South Korea, and so to run headlong into that approach, I mean, it was somewhat gratuitous. So I mean, I think that was a mistake, and maybe down the road, if there's political change in South Korea, or just a new leader, maybe you can get a blank slate and a fresh start. Even someone like Suga will be able to pursue that. But I think for the near term, I mean, it's unlikely that things are going to change. To your second question about revising the Constitution, I mean, I think you make a pertinent point about that achieving reinterpretation in 2014, 2015 maybe decrease some of the urgency. Although, I mean, I guess I would push back against the idea that Abe continued to talk about it only because he needed to ensure that Nippon Kaigi and the right was behind him. I mean, I never felt that he really was at risk of losing that support realistically. I mean, that and certainly the longer his administration went on, and after 2016, when I think his government really depended on the perception that Japan needed a stable government given the uncertainties in the world beyond Japan's shores, I don't think there was ever really a serious threat that the right would defect, for example, over those last couple of years. But I mean, I think what his handling of constitution revision after 2017, where he proposes amendments and then they kind of basically went nowhere. I mean, to some extent, it shows the ways in which Abe had matured as a politician, and I talk about this in the book, that from early on he recognized that a successful politician has to balance between ideals and political reality. And he, in a 1996 essay, he cites Max Weber, of all people, to this effect. And I think it's a really interesting concept and something that is a way of showing how he grew as a politician, because I think he was always striving to achieve that balance. But one of the reasons his first government fell apart, I think, was in part because he failed at that. And one of the reasons he succeeded after 2012 was that I think he got a much better sense of what he could and could not do. And I do think there was a realization after 2017 that if he pushed too hard on it, that if he, for example, tried to use the fact that he had, maybe in theory he had the numbers in both houses of the Diet, that had he done that, the likelihood that it would have been defeated in a referendum and that he would have been forced to resign, I think, was pretty high. And I think he sensed that intuitively and recognized that he could talk about it, but there was a difference between talking about it and really investing political capital in it. And so to that extent, I mean, it showed, I think, some growth, over the course of his career, and maybe to that extent deserves to be commended. I mean, the fact that it was so impossible for him to actually do it, I mean, to some extent, he handicapped himself. I mean, I think part of the reason, one thing that always was fascinating during the Abe years was that you actually saw, in the abstract, polls showed that the public actually supported revision. I mean, and then there's questions about, well, okay, what amendments and what changes. But in the abstract, the public would support revision. But then when asked whether they wanted it to happen under the Abe government, support for revision under Abe's watch was always lower than support for revision in the abstract. And I think to some extent that reflected in some ways, I think the public was put off by his zeal and the fact that this was something he wanted so badly, that there was something, that I think turned off voters, and something that, okay, this is not really a priority for us. We're not really, we certainly don't share, the enthusiasm, for example, the LDP's 2012 Constitution draft. This is not something that needs to be put at the top of the agenda. Why does he care so much about it? And I think that was always a wall that Abe was going to run into, and it was something that he was never really able to change the public, or really in some ways to change, the critical decision, the veto player within his own coalition, Komeito. I mean, I think getting Komeito to treat it as something that had to be prioritized over more pressing, pocketbook issues, I think was always going to be an uphill battle. And I just think Abe never really thought the timing was right to make that investment in capital to try to get it over the finish line. And I don't think that's going to change anytime in the near future. I don't think it's something that Suga really is going to invest any capital in. Is certainly, with the pandemic still with us and economic difficulties still with us, I don't think that's going to change. The last question about political ethics and morality. I mean, it's a great question, and there are so many pieces of it, as your kind of sub questions pointed to. I think the overall theme that it really points to, and what all your sub questions point to, is that one of the things that I think Abe achieved, one of my kind of favorite pieces of writing about Japanese politics ever is the Australian academic Aurelia George Mulligan's piece from the early 2000s about Japan's un-Westminster democracy. And it's a really great explanation of how Japanese democracy worked during for most of the post-war era, and also that the agenda of the reformers was moving towards something more Westminster in style. And I think it's in some ways it's kind of an irony that from the vantage point of 2020, Japan looks much more like a textbook Westminster democracy now than Britain does. I mean, it's a little funny, but and I think the thrust for the Abe years really was realizing that kind of textbook Westminster democracy and the problems you cited. I mean, the Moritomo and Kakegakuen scandals. What that reflects is that in some ways the checks on power have not caught up. So you have moved to a system where you have a prime minister who has tremendous amounts of institutional capacity to dominate the policymaking agenda, to control the bureaucracy, to control the ruling party, and if he wants to use a parliamentary majority to get policy through, he will use the parliamentary majority to get things through. And I think that was in some ways what we saw in 2015, that it didn't matter how many people were in the streets. It didn't matter what sort of complaints there were for, within the ruling coalition. I mean, he made the concessions he needed to ensure that Komeito would stay on board. And, he and made some concessions just procedurally to the opposition, but he was going to use his majority to get things done. And of course, that is traditionally not necessarily how Japanese politics has functioned. There has been a role given to the to the opposition and to a minority to be involved in the policymaking process, to have minority views heard and incorporated into the ultimate results of policymaking. That there really was a move away from that, and and as a result, I think the system as a whole needs to catch up. That you do need to find ways, whether that's inspectors general, whether that's a much more vigorous watchdog role for the press, which Martin Fackler has a great book about the role of the Japanese press during the Abe years. I think he just put out a new version of it with sort of a recap, after Abe's resignation. And Martin, his argument really is that the press. He was saying that the Abe government was playing in the major leagues, and the media was still playing in like high school ball, that they hadn't upped their game in terms of recognizing, the role that they had to play, that if the Abe government is going to wield power in this way, that there really is a new role for the press to be a watchdog in a way that it hadn't been before. There are still some constraints. We did see it play out in different ways.
I hate to interrupt,
okay.
But questions are growing. So
okay, so all right. So I want to leave it there, that I think that's the theme that ran through all of that. That the checks and balances haven't evolved to reflect the fact that you have people in power who want to use majorities that they have. And I'll stop there and can't wait for questions.
Thank you so much. Next, we actually, on the media, we also have another fantastic journalist from the Asahi Shimbun who is with us this year as an associate, Kotaro Ono, to ask a first question briefly, and then I'll open up to the growing list we see in the chat.
Thank you, Mr. Harris, for a great talk. Sonoda-san, どうもお久しぶりです。Mr. Harris, I read the Iconoclast. It's very in-depth and well-researched. And I think it's no surprise that its publication at this time is of interest of many readers. I'm Kotaro Ono, an associate of the program of US-Japan. And I've been working as a reporter for the Asahi Shimbun's politics news department for about 9 years, since 2011. And I have covered Shinzo Abe himself and the second Abe administration. And I'd like to ask Mr. Harris about my own experience as well. As you mentioned, Max Weber's ethical responsibility. Let me ask you about, to be more specific, what do you think Abe has achieved under the second half of his 8 years, which is the nearly 4 years since 2015, the security law passed? I think many of Abe's accomplishments were achieved in the first half of his administration. So I'd like to hear about your point of view. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I think there was definitely a sense certainly from 2016 onwards that stability increasingly became an end in itself, and I think that did restrict, limit some of the policy creativity towards the end. I mean, actually, and I'm on record. There was a CSIS debate about back in 2018 or 2019 about. Actually, it was right after Abe was elected to his third term as LDP leader. And the question was, should he have gotten a third term, or was it good for Japan that he got a third term? And I actually argued that he didn't even make a case really for why he deserved a third term in 2018 or what he was going to do with it. And that his campaign when he ran for his LDP third term was mostly talking about what he had achieved, but very little on what he was going to do. And I think maybe for his own sake, given how his tenure ended up breaking down in 2020, that maybe it would have been best if he had yielded power in 2018, and you would have had fresh leadership and someone new. And that also goes to show that I think that until the very end, there really wasn't a sense of who the next leader was going to be. He really hadn't laid the groundwork for the transition to someone else. And of course, we ended up seeing the transition happen pretty smoothly anyway. But I mean, that was something that he could have done more in his last term, and we really didn't see it. But no, I think your point is absolutely right. I think most of the creativity was in his first 6 years. And then by the end, I mean, I think it was really just about holding power.
And as part of holding power has been holding influence over the bureaucracy. And so Amy Katalinek, assistant professor at NYU, has a question in the chat that asks you to think about how has the change in personnel appointments influence the bureaucracy, and do the bureaucrats now have to demonstrate loyalty to the LDP in a way that was not true in the past?
No, I mean, it's a great question from Amy, and it does point to something. I mean, I quote an anonymous bureaucratic source in the book saying that compared to all of the administrative reforms that had come before to strengthen political control, the Cabinet Personnel Bureau was actually more important than any of them and introduced more change. And I think you could see it, I mean, even just anecdotally, when you interacted with bureaucrats, at MOFA or MET, during the Abe years, there was a sense of just much less daylight maybe than you would have ever heard in the past between officials and the political line of the government. And I mean, so I think there's without question. And of course, the downside of that were the Moritomo and Kakegakuen scandals. I mean, that that there very much was a sense of that to get ahead in the bureaucracy now, you do have to please your political masters. That the decisions are going to be made in the cabinet. That the cabinet is watching and collecting information on the behavior of would-be candidates for top bureaucratic jobs. And there was no question that. That you're seeing that. And I think, we're already seeing that bear out in the Suga administration. I think that the kind of relationships with senior and most bureaucrats are now well established. And it's in some ways, it's almost hard to see where sort of the political side stops and the bureaucratic side begins when you look at the uppermost levels of the administration. And so whether that's a good thing or not, I mean, that, clearly I think there are downsides to that. And, to the extent that you're not getting pushback or you're not getting the bureaucracy saying maybe this shouldn't be a priority or maybe this isn't possible. And Suga, I think what we know from his own background, for you read his 2012 book, which if you have to do that, I'm sorry, because it's kind of a slog. But I mean, this is really something that is essential to his view as a politician, that it is the job of politicians to control bureaucrats and to make them do the things that they want to do. So, I mean, that really is, I think, going to be a priority going forward.
Yes, and what level of upper reaches of the bureaucracy are so politicized? Just briefly, how deep do you think his influence extends?
Well, so the Cabinet Personnel Bureau now officially the top 500 or 600 jobs. So I think, I think it's up to the Director General level, but then of course, that has to filter down to the lower level, right? I mean, everyone knows now that you want to rise. And, the fact that the opposition is so weak and the prospects for any sort of change of ruling party are so diminished. I mean, that only is going to reinforce, the extent that, you can't cross your political masters, that if you want to move ahead. And that does have, that does, I think, can have some real baleful consequences down the road. I mean, I will say there is a positive side that we saw during the Abe years to the control of the bureaucracy. And that was, I think, they really were willing to use the cabinet personnel power to give opportunities to women. And I think, putting women in director generalships that you hadn't had before and in administrative vice ministerial jobs that you hadn't seen before. I think that was a consistent trend throughout the Abe years. And now that you see, I think, greater numbers of women entering the elite bureaucracy, something like 40% of the test takers last year were women. I mean, I think as that changes, I mean, I think that has been that was a priority during the Abe years. And hopefully that will continue to be under Suga as well.
We have two questions in the chat that I'm going to ask. I'm going to briefly summarize and ask you to respond to both. And so we have from Bill Overholt, mispronounced. He would like to inquire about Abe's domestic economy international implications. So how can you connect the Abenomics to international economic policy? And also on the international side, we see Chris Hughes asking you to talk a little bit more about the US-Japan alliance relationship. Specifically, how has Japan been able to strengthen its role as a partner to the United States, especially in these last years where it came under pressure from the Trump administration? If you could try and briefly answer, and then we'll open up to a few last questions.
Yeah, that first question is a big one, and it touches on a lot. I mean, to a certain extent, Abenomics was entirely about Japan's global competitiveness. I mean, and that is sort of the overarching theme, and recognizing that if Japan is not growing, if it is not prosperous, that its voice is going to be missing internationally, and so you almost have to go outside in when looking at what Abenomics was trying to do, and then within that, I mean, a major portion of it was explicitly designed at increasing Japan's openness globally, making Japan open to FDI. I mean, I think still at very low levels, but it has increased from a wide base, or a low base rather. The trade agreements, I think, were a major part of it, and opening, both opening Japan's market to exporters from other countries, but also then opening new markets for Japan, integrating Japan's supply chains into a network of trade agreements, creating just new ways of drawing upon foreign labor and foreign tourism. I mean, everything was really about what's Japan's place in a region. How does Japan profit from growth elsewhere in Asia? I mean, I just don't think there was any way around that. I don't know if that quite answers Bill's question, but we could talk for a while about that. U.S.-Japan relationship. I mean, I didn't in my prepared remarks didn't really talk that much about what Abe did on the U.S.-Japan relationship. But I mean, obviously, it was an important pillar of his approach to foreign policy. I mean, I think during the Obama years, in particular, there was really a lot of creative policymaking and efforts to invest significant domestic political capital, both on the economic side with TPP and also on the security side with the new guidelines, collective self-defense, really putting a lot more meat on U.S.-Japan cooperation, and not just saying we're going to have a stronger U.S.-Japan relationship, but doing a lot and taking real risks domestically to make that possible. And I think then we look at the Trump years, and a lot of, I think, what Abe did with Trump was protecting the achievements of what he did during the first part of his tenure, ensuring that you have a U.S. president who maybe was less committed to the alliance, but ensuring that that administration could not do too much damage. And so you got a U.S.-Japan trade agreement that I think preserved a lot of what was agreed to in TPP. You managed to avoid some of the more ruinous threats from the Trump administration, whether that's pulling U.S. troops out. We'll see what happens in host nation support talks. I mean, that could go south, obviously. You didn't get automobile tariffs that were threatened. I mean, I think a lot of what was achieved was defensive during the Abe years, but that was still important. I mean, I think given what could have gone wrong, I think that mattered a lot. But I think he also did finally show through both the Obama years and the Trump years, the extent to which Japan doesn't really have an alternative when looking at the region to keeping the U.S. engaged, politically, economically, and militarily. And so much effort has, I think, been expended on that, and will continue to be. That if the U.S. were to reduce its footprint in Asia, I mean, it's the alternatives, I think, for Japan are unpalatable. And I think they really don't want to have to face that. And certainly the domestic political implications of having to come up with an alternative to an alliance-centered approach to foreign policy, I think are stark. And I think, Suga, of course, is going to try to do the same thing, and we'll see what happens in November. I mean, that's going to obviously have major implications for Japan.
Great. We have a few more questions in the chat, but if anyone wants to raise a blue hand, that's another way, and I will call on you to speak your own question. And so if I do not see a blue hand, I think I do see one more chat. Taro Tsuda would like to ask about Abe's influence as prime minister.
Yeah, if I'm looking at the chat, former prime minister, I think it's a really interesting question. I think some have wondered whether he would make another run for the premiership, which I think seems unlikely. Clearly, there's a lot of precedent for former prime ministers playing significant roles behind the scenes. I mean, he's still, essentially the de facto leader of the LDP's largest faction. He's also, I think, its most prominent right-wing voice. And I think, now that he's made 2 visits to Yasukuni since he resigned, clearly he wants to continue to play that role. I think also just knowing his personality, knowing, he's just such a, he wants to be in the arena. He almost can't keep himself out, and wants to speak up and wants to make his thoughts heard. I don't think he's going to be a quiet former prime minister. I think he's, if his successors are going in directions or doing things that he disagrees with, I don't think he will hesitate. Certainly down the road. I mean, I think in the near term, of course, he's going to back Suga because Suga is carrying on his work. But I think as long as he's in the Diet, I don't think he's going to be shy about his views. In the meantime, I also think there's going to be a place for him as an informal envoy for Suga or for other prime ministers. I mean, I think he is respected in the region. I think there are a lot of, has good relationships with leaders across the region. There'll be work for him to do, I think, on that front for years to come. And of course, that was a role that his grandfather played after he resigned in 1960 as well. So there's a fine tradition there. We'll have to see how much longer he stays in politics. There's some, work to groom the next generation of the Abe Kishi dynasty, but I think there'll be lots for him to do.
Yes, indeed. And you have really given us an incredible overview of how Prime Minister Abe laid a path that will now be continued, because there was this establishment of stronger political control, a clear set of directions for an economic policy that you've explained will continue. And I would say in some ways your discussion about the issue of, in answer to the questions on constitutional revision, you've highlighted that even where he was highly motivated, he recognized the limits, the wall, and did not go forward. And so I would add a legacy of Prime Minister Abe that I hope is appreciated, is the strength of Japan's checks and balances and pacifist sentiment. And that in some ways, while he personally did a poor job managing relations with South Korea, as you said, he actually has shown a legacy that even with a fairly hawkish prime minister with a large majority and a strong commitment to constitutional revision, he could not do it. And that should ease some of the worries we hear in the region about Japan going on a military track, that really there were incremental adjustments to strengthen the US-Japan alliance, but nothing that should be alarming. And so it is an interesting question about going forward. Will Japan have more opportunities in foreign policy if others do see this lesson of reassurance? Or perhaps I'm reading between the lines too much. And of course, Prime Minister Abe, if he is continuing to be influential, many think that he will, in foreign policy, continue to advise Prime Minister Suga. So we don't know yet whether he will try to have a second round on the foreign policy front. But I'm just really grateful that you've given us this fantastic overview of a very important figure in Japanese politics. And it was great that we had Mr. Sonoda and Mr. Ono from the Asahi Shimbun to sort of lead off discussion, to journalists who are very closely following Prime Minister Abe. And we've also had a nice audience, including participation from a wide range. So I want to thank you all very much. And I also would thank Prime Minister Abe for having given a smooth transition to Japan. And I hope the United States can follow that. The idea that, you know, you have this easy transition. We'll see what's ahead for the United States and its own leadership transition ahead. Thank you all for joining. Thank you to the program staff for helping to put this all together.
Thank you. It was really, really a pleasure.